Hello and a warm welcome to UK Weather Events of the Past with me, David Phillips. In today's episode, we'll take a look back to the big freeze of February 2009. The winters of 2008, 2009 and 2010 provided the UK with sub-zero temperatures and heavy snowfall. In this documentary, meteorologist John Kettley looks back at the events of February 2009.
February 1st, 2009 saw the biggest snowfall in Britain for 18 years. In the days that followed, Britain was gripped by travel chaos, personal drama, and lucky escapes.
When it went wrong, we just knew that something bad was going to happen.
All over the country, everyday life was turned upside down by deep, blinding snow. Millions were stranded at home. Ordinary journeys became a battle against the elements, sometimes with dramatic consequences.
It's going to be all right.
This is the story of why, after 2 decades of mild winters, Britain would fall into the grip of Arctic conditions. And why some parts of the country just ground to a halt.
We were pretty much spot on with when the snow was going to come and where it was going to be heaviest.
But it wasn't all doom and gloom. With the snow came relief from the grind of everyday life. Snowballs and snowmen replaced recession and credit crunch.
It's positive for people who had this camaraderie thrust upon them by the elements.
So what had led to Britain's sudden big freeze? And when might it happen again? London, mid-January 2009. Winds were mild, almost balmy. Temperatures were 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. For the Met Office, who predict Britain's weather, this was around average for the time of year.
Britain is kept warm most winters because we have the Gulf Stream. So when the winds are coming in off the Atlantic, that means that for our latitude, we're actually quite mild compared to the rest of the world.
But on the 15th of January 2009, Sarah Davies, one of the Met Office's forecasters, and her colleagues suddenly became concerned. They had spotted a new and curious weather pattern developing 20 to 30 miles above the Arctic Circle, pushing freezing air south. And at the same time, there was a movement of moist air coming up from France. The Met Office forecasters feared that if these two weather systems clashed, it would trigger the perfect winter storm and drop the biggest snowfall on the British Isles for almost 2 decades.
We started to get an indication that there was something quite big on the way. The Met Office issued their lowest tier of warning and advisory on the Thursday.
They forecast a snowstorm in early February. As the collision between the two weather systems became more and more likely, they stepped up their alerts.
We upgraded it to an early warning on the Saturday. By Sunday, we'd issued a warning of an extreme event.
Right on cue, it started to snow. First, a freezing blizzard hit London and the southeast, then moved on to paralyze the rest of southern England. On Monday morning, exactly 5 days after the first warning, people woke up to find themselves in Arctic conditions. The Met Office forecasters had been right. An average of 6 inches of snow had fallen on the country.
We were spot on with when the snow was going to come, how much snow was going to come, and where it was going to be heaviest.
The thickest blanket of snow for 2 decades hit southern commuters the hardest. But out of the chaos came extraordinary stories of courage and determination. The longest walk to work that day began at 5 a.m. in Ashford, Kent. Peter Cartwright is a radiographer at London's Guy's Hospital. He needed to get to work that day because he had 15 patients awaiting treatment. His 50-mile journey from Ashford normally takes him 1.5 hours. Peter started off surprisingly well. He managed to catch a local train, but it was running extremely slowly.
I did make a call to my wife, asking her to let the hospital know that I was about two and a half to 3 hours away.
But Peter was wildly optimistic. His train terminated after just a few miles. With patients waiting for him at hospital, Peter was determined to continue and set off on foot. He walked for 10 miles. There was still 30 miles to go. The southeast of the country was not accustomed to this amount of snow. On slippery streets, the traffic began to grind to a halt. And catching a bus that day was out of the question. Most services were out of action. Even London's buses, a service that had operated valiantly throughout the Blitz, was suspended for the weather for the first time in history. And to add to the misery, most of London's tube lines were closed.
45 minutes.
4 hours into Peter Cartwright's journey in Kent, he found an open transport cafe. He was still 20 miles from work. Exhausted after walking so far, Peter tried hitching a lift.
I just got chatting to a fellow in the queue behind me, so I asked if I could tag along with him.
Peter's lift took him for the next 10 miles. He then had to start walking again. There were still 10 miles to go. Time of his journey so far, 5 hours. Conditions on the roads were treacherous. Cars skidded around like they were on ice rinks, causing accidents and congestion. Even gritting lorries became accident statistics. The snowstorm had blocked major and minor roads. Drivers were advised to stay at home, but police and emergency services still found themselves called to hundreds of serious accidents. On that first morning, 20% of the country's workforce, 6.4 million employees, failed to show up because of the blizzard. But remarkably, Peter Cartwright did finally manage to get to work. He arrived at Guy's Hospital in London a staggering 8.5 hours after leaving home. He had walked almost 20 miles in the freezing snow.
It was a personal challenge that made me keep going. To me, it was very important, and I can't think of any better reason to walk.
The snow spread west. Roads around Exeter became almost impassable. Skidding and crashed cars on the snow and ice brought further mayhem, piling more pressure on police and ambulance services. They struggled to cope in the extreme weather. On the high ground around Exeter and Dartmoor, the conditions were even worse, and over 200 motorists became stranded in their cars. Some were trapped for several hours in the blizzard, waiting for rescue. The only lifelines were mobile phones.
We're in 2 lanes of traffic that's at a standstill. I've been here for about 3.5 hours now. We're all sitting here just waiting for some rescue to happen.
Many of these stranded drivers would have to spend a freezing night before being rescued by the police and the army. Within 3 days, the snowstorm had spread from the south to the north. 29-year-old Kelly Roberts woke up to find her hometown of Wellingborough in the midst of a blizzard. Kelly was 9 months pregnant. She was about to experience one of the most dramatic days of her life.
When I found out I was expecting a baby in February, I said, oh, I better be snowing when I go into labour. Never in a million years thinking that all this would actually happen.
Kelly's husband, Scott, a delivery driver, set out on his short journey to work. He was confident that their baby wasn't due for another few days.
My journey to work would normally take me 10 minutes. It took me almost an hour to get there because the M1 was closed.
Back at home, heavily pregnant Kelly was experiencing the early signs of labour. This was her second pregnancy, and with Kettering Hospital just a few miles away, she remained calm.
I knew that was how things kind of started off, so I thought, oh, in the next day or so, we'll probably be likely to be meeting the new arrival, but I wasn't expecting anything to happen so quickly.
But as the contractions increased, Kelly called Scott. He was already on his way back. Work had been cancelled due to the weather.
Hello?
I think you need to start thinking about coming home from work. It's just that I've started having some contractions.
I'm stuck in traffic at the minute.
Would Scott get home to take Kelly to the hospital in time? Little did they realise how dramatic the events of the day would become. Why had the biggest snowfall for 18 years hit the south of England and then spread north? Met Office scientists were sure it was due to the curious event miles above the Arctic Circle that had set in motion a violent clash of two weather systems. 2009. For the first time in 2 decades, the whole of Britain was blanketed in snow. In Wellingborough, Northampton, heavily pregnant Kelly Roberts had gone into labour. Her husband, Scott, was battling through the chaos to get to her.
I'd actually said to my boss, you watch, she'll go into labour today, because I knew that the road from Wellingborough to Kettering was blocked.
Meanwhile, Kelly's contractions had increased.
It did take me by surprise, really, because I wasn't expecting things to progress as quickly as they did.
When Scott finally reached Kelly, he was desperate to get her to hospital.
I could see how much pain Kelly was in then. Very relieved when the ambulance turned up.
Safely inside the ambulance, they set off on the 8-mile journey through the snow to Kettering Hospital.
Okay, you can just take some gas on out.
That's when I started to think this might be a bit difficult, because we can't use the main road. The only other road is going through the villages. Now, I know how bad it was going on the dual carriageway to work and back, so the villages, I thought we'd have no chance.
The short trip would turn into the most dramatic of their lives.
Okay.
I need to push.
Okay, nice and steady then. All right, don't worry. Okay.
Around Britain, it wasn't just the transport system that had ground to a halt. With so many people phoning in to say they were staying at home, mobile phone circuits overloaded. In the 5 minutes after 8 a.m. on the first day of the blizzard, one major network reported that 500,000 text and phone calls were made, 50% more than normal. And those that were on the move were now getting lost, as some sat-navs became unreliable. With the sky so full of snow, they couldn't receive the satellite signals. The Federation of Small Businesses quickly calculated that the snowstorm may have cost the country £1.2 billion. But weatherman and broadcaster John Kettley believes this is overly pessimistic.
Out of the face of adversity came the positives. The unique thing about snow is that it's actually good fun for most people. There were gloom merchants, of course, saying it's cost the country £1.2 billion. But this is the computer age, for goodness sake. You could still have a snowball fight and still work from home as well. It's great.
Not only could snowbound Britons send emails, they could shop too. Online commerce received an unexpected boost. This online shopping site's records showed a 3-fold increase in traffic, which peaked on the worst day of the snow. One retailer sold 27,000 sledges in the first week, their website registering 9,000 hits in a single minute. And the sale of carrots was up too, with one supermarket site recording a 60% increase in the essential dress of any good snowman.
Steady, go and flop and do your snow angels.
Another extraordinary change also swept the country when the snow arrived. The millions of parents who failed to get to work found themselves reliving childhood experiences with their own children, many of whom had never seen snow on this scale before.
I think childhood and snow are connected. When you're 6, 7 years old and snow comes and it completely changes the world that you are used to, that has a very powerful effect.
Charlie English is a writer who chronicles our obsession with snow.
I woke up very early with the children. It was still dark and we looked out and we could see the big fat snowflakes. Then the neighbours' children came out from the house around the back and other children from across the street. And pretty soon all the kids in the area seemed to be throwing snowballs at each other, building snowmen. It was really quite a magical scene. It makes you interact with your community. You end up talking to your neighbours and your family.
No! I'm going!
We tend to be workaholics, and it's quite good to be reminded that there are other things beyond that.
But with the winter weather fun came danger. Rother Valley Country Park, Rotherham, Tuesday, February the 3rd.
There was a lot of activity on the slope, a lot of families here with their children sledging as well.
Julian McKay was here with his 2 young sons. He noticed a group of teenage girls using this car roof as a makeshift sledge.
They were coming down the slope from about 30 yards to 40 yards up the slope and jumping off it quite comfortably.
But when the 5 teenagers took the car roof to the top of the hill, Julian could only stand and watch as they careered out of control.
They were going about 50 miles an hour, shouting, "Get out the way." I think the whole slope sort of fell silent, those who were watching it, and just to see what would happen next, were they going to get off it? But I think it was too fast, they couldn't.
Their sledge then collided with a wire fence at the base of the slope. 4 of the 5 girls remained on the sledge as it slowed to a stop, but one of them was thrown off.
We then stood for what was possibly no more than 3 seconds, just hoping that the girls would get up. But there was no movement whatsoever from them.
Julian raced to the scene. All of the 5 girls were injured, but one was critical. Within minutes, the air ambulance arrived. But tragically, the girl had received fatal injuries and died within hours of reaching hospital.
The whole day was a day of total happiness for everybody, you know, the way it started. The enjoyment turned to sadness very quickly. A day that I'll never forget, and I don't think people here will ever forget that sort of day.
Just a few miles from Rotherham lie the hills of Huddersfield. Here, another day of fun in the snow was about to take a dramatic turn. 12-year-old Chloe Parkinson and her best friend, 11-year-old Martine Hughes, were sledging in Ferney Bridge.
It really slowed at the top, and it wasn't like all snowy that day because a bit of ice was coming off and it was a bit grassy, so we didn't think it would be that fast.
The girls were sledging down this steep 300-foot hill.
Well, when we was first going down, I was like really excited and like we thought it was going to be like all the other sledges, like really fun. But when it went wrong, we just knew that something bad was going to happen.
As they careered down the icy slope, Martine and Chloe's sledge ran out of control.
Tried to roll off it and that didn't work, and then I shouted to Martine. We put the brakes on and all we did was just skid.
They plunged down this 30-foot sheer drop and crashed into the icy river below.
It was really cold. I didn't know what to do.
Chloe found herself trapped underwater, pinned down by a heavy log.
So I was like under the water, trying to keep hold of my breath. She was under the water for like 30 seconds or something, and like we just couldn't take the log off her.
As Martine struggled in vain to free her friend, her screams were heard by 2 teenage boys.
We saw Martine and Chloe sledging down the hill.
Next thing we knew, they were in the river screaming for help, so we came flying down the hill.
Stephen Keating and Matthew Arnell then jumped into the freezing river.
It took ages for us to get in because we couldn't slide in without hurting ourselves.
I went round a bit downriver and jumped in and crossed the river and went over to the other side.
Wading into the freezing water, the boys lifted the log off Chloe, freeing her just in time.
Steve came back across the river and got him, and then I piggybacked Martine across to the other side of the river.
Yeah, it was really slippery.
Icy, yeah.
Icy. It was quite hard, but we just wanted to get him back.
Looking at it now, it just like makes me feel really scared. It's much higher than I thought, and to think that I went through that.
And what of modest local heroes Stephen and Matthew made of their newfound celebrity?
Everybody's been saying well done to us.
Yeah.
And proud of us. And we're brave for going in, not thinking of our own lives.
It's like a lesson to us to always look and be careful to like what we're doing and stuff. I'm grateful and I'm happy with what they did for us. Shut up.
February 2009 was the result of a perfect winter storm. A front of moist air was moving up from France. But in the first week of February, it collided with abnormally cold east winds. Usually, Britain is lashed by mild westerly winds off the Atlantic. But in the 2 weeks leading up to the storm, events above the North Pole reversed the wind direction. What had caused the change? Normally, the temperature up here is minus 70 degrees Celsius. But dense air had suddenly flowed into the stratosphere 30 miles above the Arctic, and it caused a rapid temperature rise.
In the middle of January, the Met Office noticed that temperatures had gone up markedly in the stratosphere by around about 50 degrees.
This temperature increase happens every few years, and when it does, it throws the whole Arctic system out of balance. This year, it reversed the normal westerly winds to freezing easterly winds, which made their way down through the atmosphere towards Britain.
And at this point, we updated our winter forecast to indicate that these winds were going to move down to the surface. We're going to get an easterly wind on the surface of the globe, which meant that the temperature was going to get much lower across the United Kingdom.
At the same time as these easterly winds were coming down from the Arctic, the warm, moist front was moving across France towards the UK. The forecasters had to predict when they would collide and how much snow it would produce. And when the blizzard hit, people all over the country experienced new and dramatic situations that would stay with them for the rest of their lives.
That's it, everything's okay.
In Wellingborough, Northamptonshire, Kelly Roberts was in labour on the way to hospital, but the roads were at a standstill because of the snow. For 7 days, Snowstorm Britain struggled in the snow. During the week of the blizzard, many of Britain's roads had seized up and become impassable. The advice was, don't make a journey if you could possibly avoid it. This was of little help to Kelly Roberts, who is now having contractions in the back of an ambulance.
Everything's going to be all right, okay? Don't worry about anything.
3 hours into her labour, her ambulance was making very slow progress to Kettering Hospital.
The chap in the back of the ambulance, he was really, really good. The way he was talking, he's joking around, it was almost like, oh yeah, this happens at least once a week, it's not a problem.
That's it, everything's okay, yep.
Just minutes from the hospital, the traffic ground to a halt on the slip road of the A14.
Okay, don't worry, nice and steady, nice and steady.
All you could see was the side of lorries. We were literally inches away from these lorries.
It was now obvious they weren't going to make the hospital in time. Kelly was going to have to give birth in the back of the ambulance.
All right, okay, just take your time.
You're trying to sort of fight against it, but you just can't. You've got to kind of go with the flow and just get on and do it, but you can't stop yourself.
Deep breaths on there, deep breaths. All right, baby's coming. Push, just push. Baby's coming now, OK? It's going to be all right.
I can remember thinking, it's not going to be born in an ambulance. She's not going to be born in an ambulance. And then all of a sudden she was.
Steady. Do it. It's a baby girl. Oh, bless you. It's a little baby girl. Well done.
At 12:05 p.m. at Junction 7, baby Amy was born.
Bless you. All right.
The ambulance crew announced her arrival to fellow stranded motorists and lorry drivers. In celebration, they tooted their horns.
I did hear lots and lots of shouting, but it didn't obviously register, you know, just had a baby. It didn't register what was happening, but the ambulance lady told us later on that she'd said it's a girl, and all the lorry drivers had cheered and things, which was nice of them.
Now safely home, baby Amy is blissfully unaware of her dramatic birth that took place here on a slip road.
Yeah, I think it'll be a story that'll last for quite a while.
Yeah. Every time we take her to Kettering,
yeah,
as we drive up the slip road. I'm sure she'll be sick of it by the time she's 14, but
In the grip of such severe weather, the whole country was on the alert for anything unusual. This twister was caught on camera just off the coast of Cornwall. A vortex of wind sucked up seawater high into the storm clouds above. By the end of the week, the extreme winter weather changed again. The melting snow giving way to lethal ice. On Friday, February 6th, giant sheets of falling ice forced the closure of both 7 crossings. Having formed on the overhead gantries, 3-foot slabs of ice crashed down onto cars and the roadway below. Despite 6 cars having their windscreen smashed, luckily no one was injured. For the first time in their history, both bridges into Wales were shut down due to the weather. Even the mountains were experiencing the worst snow and ice conditions for many years. In North Wales, Snowdon's steep slopes had turned into sheet ice.
On the slopes, it's a bit like a skating rink, on a slant, really.
In the week of Snowstorm Britain, 4 climbers lost their lives in Snowdonia. Llanberis Mountain Rescue found themselves inundated with calls. One emergency call was from experienced climber Matt Love.
Hello, emergency rescue, please.
Which mountain are you on?
In Snowdon.
What's happened? Is anyone hurt?
Matt had just watched in horror as 2 friends fell on the ice.
Will just slipped, and he slipped so fast he disappeared in a split second. I didn't realise that could happen so fast, and then Matt fell near enough straight behind him.
How badly hurt are they?
We don't know, we've lost them. They fell straight off the mountain.
My first thought was that they had died. I thought that was it.
It was a race against time. If they were alive and injured, they could still freeze to death.
The temperature drops by about 3 degrees per 1,000 feet you ascend, so if it's already freezing in the valley, it'll be -9, -10 on the top of Snowdon. You put some wind speed into that, and suddenly you've got wind chill factors of maybe -15.
One of the men had fallen nearly 700 feet, sustaining serious injuries. He was found using the helicopter's night vision and heat-seeking camera. Eventually, all 4 climbers were airlifted to safety. Matt and his friends are fortunate to be alive.
They were all extremely lucky. If they were cats and had 9 lives, I suspect they used up quite a few of them.
It was a triumph for the rescue services.
What they did for us was amazing, and without them, it could have been so much worse.
But the luckiest escape came as Caroline Saunders was driving home at night to Bishop Burton, East Yorkshire.
I just lost control. I think, it must have been like the black ice on the road. And then I was just being flung around in the car, and the next thing I just saw the fence coming towards me. and then I just felt like I was in a roller coaster and my car tipping. The next thing I know, I was roofed down in the pond.
Crashing through the thin ice, Caroline was trapped upside down in her sinking car.
Freezing cold, absolutely freezing cold, and I couldn't get out, and I just saw these lights, just pressed my horn and just banged frantically on the window thinking, please just come and help me.
She was spotted by a passing taxi driver, James Brown.
All I could see was like a hand banging against the inside of the window.
This is a recording of his emergency 999 call. Caroline's car horn is clearly audible in the background.
There's someone upside down in Bishopburton Pond. They're trying to get out of the car.
Right, there's been a car accident?
Yeah, there's a car now. They're upside down. They're trying to get out. All right, hang on, hang on. I'm going to have to save them. Yeah, they're in the pond now. I'm going to have to save them, all right?
Despite the emergency services telling him to wait for help, James knew this was a desperate situation. He made a life-or-death decision, waded into the freezing pond and smashed through the driver's window.
The worst thing was the dark, I was having to feel inside for her. But when I felt her hand, you know, kept all of it tight and dragged her out.
The emergency services were full of praise for James's actions.
I think today we would have been talking about another young driver death had he not taken those actions last night.
James's heroism saved Caroline's life. The biting easterly wind that froze Britain happens every 2 or 3 years. But when this wind collided with moist air coming up from France directly over London, it turned into an event that only occurs every 2 to 3 decades. The result? A massive blizzard.
What we had at the beginning of February was the Battle of Britain in meteorological terms, really. We had the cold air, which had swept further south than normal, certainly normal winters of recent years, coming down across the country, and it was battling up against the mild, very wet southwesterly wind across the south coast of England. On this occasion, the cold air won the battle, and that meant that instead of rain, we had some pretty heavy wet snow.
But just how rare are Britain's extreme snow events? They appear to run in cycles. Over the last 60 years, Britain has suffered heavy snowfalls in regular intervals.
This is how snowed-up Britain looks from the air. And here's Leicester's mainline station. But where are the trains? Heading back towards London over the countryside, we find the trains marooned in the deep snow.
In 1947, austerity Britain shivered in one of the worst winters on record. From January the 22nd to March the 17th, snow fell every day somewhere in the UK. As the heaviest snowfalls for 130 years cut off large areas of the country, in the Midlands it reached 6 feet deep. The Air Force was called in to drop emergency supplies. The onslaught of snow battered a country struggling to recover from the Second World War. With roads blocked, coal supplies were stranded at the collieries. Britain faced an energy crisis. Emergency legislation cut electricity supplies, TV was shut down, and Buckingham Palace was reduced to working by candlelight. As the freeze dragged on, even the food supply was under threat.
The frost never went away. The snow came down, it got compacted, the frost was very severe. Another batch of heavy snow came on top of that, and so the ground was getting colder and colder and colder. The farmers couldn't dig up the crops, and so there was a near famine in this country by the end of the winter.
But this was make do and mend Britain. And at least frozen lakes and ponds offered light relief.
The worst spell of weather for 50 years. We hope it'll be 50 more before we get another.
But Britain didn't have to wait 50 years, as the winter of 1963 was destined to be another record breaker. Although there was less snow than in 1947, it was the coldest winter since 1740.
3 people died battling against the snow, and 2 more were suffocated in a snowbound car.
In Braemar, Aberdeenshire, the mercury plummeted to minus 22.2 degrees Celsius. And nationwide, mean temperatures barely hovered above freezing.
It was cold enough that even some lakes, some rivers, and even the sea froze over, and there are reports even of people managing to drive across the Thames at Windsor.
"1963 was so much worse than anything we saw in 2009. The temperatures were far lower, and the freeze continued far longer.
January and February did see very severe frosts. New falls of snow would come down on top of highly compacted ice, which had been developing for weeks after weeks after weeks.
Britain's infrastructure took a battering. Not only were the roads and railways impassable, but once again, the crops froze in the fields, and the power went off.
In Piccadilly, the lights went out for the first time since 1949. Hospitals were cut off without warning.
But as the blackout continued, it was a different crisis that gripped the nation's housewives.
It's the question of bottles. You see, the housewife is virtually hiding the bottles underneath the snow in rather similar to this.
With millions of empty bottles lost in the snow and the rest frozen on the doorstep, milk delivery had reached crisis point.
We would like all the customers to be on the doorstep more or less with their money to pay their accounts, because all these delays keep the men out late, and if the roads freeze, then we're in trouble again, you see.
Finally, on March 6th, the thaw arrived, along with the inevitable floods and recriminations.
We can only hope that the public and local authorities who are caught with their pants down will pull their socks up, if you see what we mean.
But it seems we never learn. In 1991, the last time we had a severe winter, we were told we had the wrong type of snow.
If you are able to reach your destination by alternative means, we strongly recommend that you do so.
British Rail famously blamed the unusual soft powder snow for paralysing the network.
They came out with all these excuses. The powdery snow was sticking on the rails, it was getting into the engines, causing all sorts of chaos at British Rail.
The dry snow of 1991 was due to exceptionally cold winds sweeping down from Siberia. But in February 2009, the snow was the normal wet type.
Look at that. Absolutely fantastic. All compacted, you can make a fantastic snowman with that. That is really good British snow.
Even though the snow this time was the right type, the result was all too familiar.
The full extent of the disruption is now coming clear. Those stuck at bus stops, train stations and airports have had plenty of time to ask whether some of it could have been prevented.
Jim Dale is a risk meteorologist. He advises businesses on the best way to deal with extreme weather.
In the UK, 80% of companies are weather sensitive to one degree or another. You know, that takes in a lot of companies.
He believes Britain needs to be more proactive when extreme weather strikes.
I think in this country we have a real problem with this, where it's heads in the sand, it's ostrich time.
The snowstorm of February 2009 may have been the worst for a generation. But if we were to ask our distant ancestors, they would have far worse tales to tell. From the mid-16th century, Britain was blighted by the Little Ice Age.
Crops failed, the glaciers advanced into alpine valleys, there were famines in parts of Britain.
Even though life was hard, the onset of winter was seen as an opportunity for celebration. Frost fairs would spring up whenever the River Thames froze over.
I think they were probably impromptu social events, and enterprising businessmen, bakers and pie makers and whatever, went out onto the ice, setting up stalls and puppet shows, and there was a lot of drinking and lechery apparently as well, and presumably did what the British do in most such situations and drank rather a lot and got off with each other.
This cold snap lasted for an unimaginable 200 years. Although our climate is now much milder, we can still experience extreme winters. And if this happens every 2 or 3 decades, could this be part of a cycle?
It's not necessarily cyclical, it's just an average. So we do expect these sort of events to happen 1 in 20 years. However, I'm not saying that we won't have another one now for 20 years. We could have it next year, we could have it the year after, or we could have it in 40 years' time.
Weather broadcaster John Kettley has also remained unconvinced there is a cycle.
In recent days, weeks, we've been talking about this has been the heaviest snowfall since the winter of 1990-91. Don't forget that the 2 previous winters to that were extremely mild. They were record-breaking mild winters, so I'm not a great fan of cyclical forecasting at all. It may just be a huge coincidence as far as I'm concerned.
But with climate change less easy to dismiss, how will global warming affect Britain's winter weather? Can we expect scenes like this to disappear from our winter landscape altogether? Though in February 2009 had struck Britain, the country was returning to normal. As the snow and ice melted away, so questions began. If global warming is heating the world, why do we have such a bad winter? And will it put an end to our worst snowstorms? Scientists are cautious.
Climate scientists predict that with climate change, these sort of snow events will get less and less common in the future. Of course, back in 1850, this was a 1 in 5-year event. Now it's a 1 in 20-year event, and it will get less and less likely as time goes on. However, that's not to say we'll never get snow. Of course, it rains in the desert, but it's still the desert.
The global warming experts have put across this story that for the next 50, 100 years, certainly, it's just going to get warmer and snow is going to become a thing of the past. That is certainly not the case. In my opinion, we're not going to see that situation. I still think that we will see snow events, pretty heavy ones on occasions as well. We are in a temperate latitude. We're not too far away from the poles. We are not just suddenly going to go into a Mediterranean climate, because one thing to remember is this: Nice has snow, and Nice is far further south than we are.
Whatever the effects of global warming, Britain is likely to get snow. When the next snowstorm will strike, it is impossible to say. But one thing is for sure: there are plenty of people who despair at Britain's inability to cope.
I think it's terrible. We've just come back from America with just as bad snow as this, and it's still running. It's amazing.
If someone like Canada can manage it, I don't understand why we can't.
So how do snowbound cities like New York, Toronto and Moscow cope? This is Moscow's winter weather. It's like this every year.
If you live somewhere like Moscow or in Canada, it's very continental. It doesn't really matter which way the wind's coming. It's going to be cold and it's going to be snowy at times. So it's much easier for them because they get the snow every single year.
Muscovites are well prepared for their yearly battle with nature. 2,500 snowplows are on standby to roll into action, and specially designed Russian snow-gathering machines suddenly appear on streets. Behind these tractors come container lorries, ready to ship the snow outside the city. An army of 50,000 workers keep Moscow's roads passable. They make vital electrical contact points work, so public tram and tube networks stay open. And Russian mothers scoff at the idea of closing schools and send their kids off each morning. When it's bad, Muscovites simply put snow chains on their shoes.
It is much easier to walk with the ice walkers. It makes you feel that you're a lot less likely to get home with a broken limb.
New York, too, is just as well prepared. Thousands of snow plows and hundreds of salt spreaders are at the ready during the winter months. In extreme snow conditions, teams work round the clock to keep roads free. Planes take off whatever the weather, their wings doused with antifreeze to brave the freezing air. And when the weather becomes impossible, New York declares a snow day. Schools automatically close and commuters take the day off, knowing they'll make up the lost time when the blizzard ceases.
These areas live the weather, and their infrastructure is built and geared up to
these kind of extreme events.
Britons always complain when our cities grind to a halt. So is it time to start investing in bigger and better support schemes?
If we go to such extremes in terms of expenditure, I think it's legitimate to say it probably would be a waste of money.
We don't have snowplows in sufficient quantities in this city to deal with the roads that are currently impassable, nor do I think it would be a good investment of taxpayers' money to have snowplows, for an incident of a kind that only occurs once every 20 years.
My memory goes back to 1976. We had a minister for drought after a long hot summer, and within a week the rain was coming down and there was flooding in the autumn. A minister for snow would be an absolute joke in this country.
So what should we do when the next bad winter happens?
It wouldn't be too much of a hassle to have a spade in the back of a car, for example. Councils could think about delivering a bag of grit to every household so that they can get on with their own business around their own house and making pathways and walkways that much safer. The way I feel to deal with schools is based around the internet. The children were not able to get to school, so the school posted homework on the internet for the children to pick up and do whilst they were at home. So there's one very good example of what schools can do.
The first week in February 2009 was our snowiest for 18 years. A once-in-a-generation event transformed the British landscape. But Britain's relationship with the weather turned frosty. There was travel chaos and shutdown, followed by struggle and drama. But out of the week came unselfish acts of bravery and brief, spontaneous moments of fun.
Positive for many kids, obviously, getting the day off school. It's positive for people who had this camaraderie thrust upon them by the elements. And maybe, despite the protestations about global warming, maybe we still will, through the next century, see decent snowfall every now and again. That'll be great.
No one knows when the next one is due. But when the great white blizzard does appear, Britain once again will change into an astonishing winter wonderland.
Thank you very much for watching this documentary. Please consider subscribing if you would like more historical weather events of the past. And I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.